Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Awesome.
Let's give it maybe a few more minutes. All right, we are a bit fewer today, but let's get started. I put a link to the Google Doc with the meeting notes into the chat. So please make a note if you're attending. Also, if there is anyone who hasn't attended before, welcome. And if you'd like to introduce yourself, please go ahead.
I can go and introduce myself. My name is Sam Zidell. I work for Rectop Systems, and I'm in the, I guess it's technically the kind of DevOps release engineering group. We build our own internally we build our own operating system. It's not actually based on Linux, but there's a lot of interest. I mean, there's a lot of similar interests and concerns that span operating systems. So,
Welcome, Sam.
thank you.
Anyone else? All right. So in case you don't know me, I'm Thomas Newman. I work for Ericsson in the product security organization, and I'm also the lead for this small initiative. So we have a couple of things on the agenda for now, and please free if you have any, if you want to add any other open items, please go ahead and add them to the Google Doc. But I guess that when we are a little bit fewer, we could, I think, get started from at least looking through some of these proposed pull requests. So we had quite a few pull requests on this recommended guide last week. And should we start with yours, Sidesh?
Sure. I think it got approved, right? Last time.
I think we at least had some reviews on this. So
Yeah. So I think you approved it 2 days ago, and then Jörg or George
yeah,
approved it as well.
yeah. So this looked, at least from my side, I think that the changes look good. I think I had like a couple of questions on this, but I think that we sorted that offline, and I saw that you had already updated also the list of recommended options.
Yes, I did.
Yes. So I think that this is in good shape. So from my side, I think this is I'm happy to have this one merged.
Perfect.
Hello, Randall, as well. We just started to go through these pull requests.
Awesome. Tell you, Thomas, sorry about that. I had an LF meeting prior.
No worries. So we were just looking at the Sidesh editions, and they all looked good from our point of view.
Yes, I reviewed them as well. They looked good on my point of view as well.
Yeah. So I think that then this Fortify source 3 is then done. I need to. So I'm actually not sure whether I can go and approve these, but I can be in contact with C-Rob and make sure we can get this merged. Then we had also something from.
Well, just for the record,
Yeah.
what you need to do, I can merge them for you. First of all, did you guys know that we have notes and best practices where we're supposed to sign in? Because just saying. But anyway, just email operations. It's operations@openssf.org and copy Crow requesting to be added to the team, to the best practices team, because that's the team you need to be added to be able to merge. And basically Crow should approve it, and that's how you get put into GitHub, just so you know.
All right.
So it's operations@openssf.org.
I'll try.
But yes, you might want to give Crow a heads up that you're sending out that email. But I honestly doubt that he would have a problem with approving it.
Yeah. I'll just make some notes here while we.
Yeah.
Then which one is the next one? So there's this. Okay, so this one was from you, Randall. So add GCC-V section in compiler hardening guide.
Yeah.
There was some back and forth between you and George, right? But I think that this also looked good to me.
Yeah, I think it's important to considering that most people in their build pipelines are using Ubuntu, Debian, and if you get GCC through them, then you will have default flags, even if it's in a container.
Mm-hmm. And you also had like, I guess that this is also now related to this. This is also now related to this other Google doc that you started compiling together, right? Where you are collecting the different
Yes.
different default options.
Yes.
So I think that like this, I think that the additional text look good. How do you see like the relation between the two documents, right? So,
well, let me say this. A lot of people don't realize this. So a lot of people because I deal with a lot of compiler flag problems in Gentoo. And if you go to our IRC, it's pretty much dedicated. Like the hashtag Gentoo channel, like I'm not trying to be like that about it, but most of the time the problem is that people went or got flags from somewhere, very questionable where they get these flags from, and they just enable everything because they think it's like switches that you just switch things on. I mean, what could possibly happen? It can't go any slower, but that's the problem. Is then they realize that first of all, a lot of your distros, if you're talking about compiling for distros, they are going to do the work for you. So you really shouldn't, like, the secret to installing Gentoo is installing it without flags. Main reason why is because we've already done all the work for you. So yeah. So, but yeah, like a lot of people don't get that. So I think that this is an important note, depending on your use case, and depending what you're trying to do. I know it's very typical now to just use Docker, use, apt add, and just add GCC dev or whatever. But my recommendation would be check your flags, make sure the right things are enabled. Don't depend on anybody's security, because that's another one argument I hear a lot from end users is they think that like as distros, we're going to take care of all of your security issues. That's just not true.
I think the challenge tends to be that with tools like GCC, you have, a couple of hundred different flags. Their meanings aren't necessarily well understood, and the combinations of some of those flags are even less understood.
Correct.
It's just a proverbial challenge.
Could you share a link to the other doc that you're writing up?
Sure. Let me try to find it. I'll share it in the Slack because it's really hard to find it on my phone.
I can share a link. Let me share an issue to the issue, and then the issue has a link to the doc. So it's also in the meeting notes. But
awesome, thank you, Thomas.
Yeah,
thanks.
And also, Sadish, I've talked to a few different people from the distro GCC teams, and it's very hard to nail down what default profile actually means.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Yes.
Yeah. So that's why, Thomas, I decided the -V, because I think this is also a little bit like, if you really just wanted to know, that's what you would do.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So of course, it requires some effort to go through the output, but yeah, I think that is like the only way to be sure, right? That you actually look at the output of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that being said, there are a few people out there. Like if you really wanted, like when I first started years ago figuring out GCC, I mean, there's a lot of people that have good blogs. So if it's a flag that like is a big thing, you might actually find something on Google that will go in depth, like what happens when you enable it or you don't enable it, or when you add these other flags. Some people actually do have blogs if the flag is like important enough.
Yeah.
So I think the only challenge with adding the GCC -v section is helping people look for the flags that are useful.
Mhm.
Like, for example, you get this whole list of configure flags for GCC, and which ones of those are important is something that we probably need to point out. Like enable default pi, for example, is something that you want to highlight, and there'd be others. So the challenge would be to kind of get those out and highlight those compared to like 100 other options that are in there.
See, I thought that would have been the way that I was going to address this. And what I suggested to George was possibly adding another column, because that way, like if you have default pi, you don't need to enable pi. I mean, I think there's also default no pi too.
Right.
But I think it would just be good to point out, like, if you have these, then you really don't have to worry about these.
Okay. Alternatively, would it make sense to kind of, in the interest of portability, always have all of the security flags in there?
Possibly. I don't know. What do you think, Thomas? I'll open it up.
Yeah, so I'm like a little bit wondering that isn't this kind of like which flags are relevant? Isn't that kind of also what we are trying to address by compiling this guide in the first place, right? So the things that you would look for as a user would presumably be the flags that we have in this in like the recommended option table or this TLDR version,
Right.
and then you can sort of look at it from like two ways. So either you might be sort of either you might be sort of missing something, or then you are doing this because you're having some issues with your build, but then again the more detailed sections in our guide would provide like these caveats with some more information. So I don't really know that, like, is your concern, Sidesh, that we should be doing something like more specifically in this guide to be like a little bit more verbose about this, that how you would actually like go about doing this, or do you think that like the guide is not sufficient to do this exercise?
So I think the -v kind of opens up a different avenue when it comes to this guide, where it says that we have all of these options, but if you look at GCC -v on your distribution, you'll find that some of these are enabled and you don't need to do that. So it sounds like an additional caveat, and maybe it's something that we put in like as an appendix, which will then also kind of talk about distribution build flags and so on, where we kind of expand on the state of flag usage, as it were, and not as like a main thing. So my worry is that it will probably just end up confusing users, and we might end up having this kind of inconsistent usage where users assume that their or developers assume that the end users are always going to be on Ubuntu, and don't add like default pipe flags, for example, assuming that it's always going to be there, or have these kind of assumptions that are distro specific. So that's basically my concern. Like it's a very useful thing to have there. It's just the positioning to kind of make sure that the messaging of the document is correct is what I'm concerned about.
Right. So would that concern be addressed by maybe adding a sentence saying that regardless of what the sort of defaults are, you can still provide them as command line options, and it will not hurt you.
Something like that would be, yeah.
And maybe even say that that's sort of like the best practice that we recommend, that you always be explicit about the hardening flags and enable them even if they are enabled by the distro you're on, to have this kind of like consistent usage. Yeah.
Yes, like basically promoting portability so that there are no assumptions made about the underlying platform. But we also kind of go a step further and explain that these are things that distributions provide as a value add.
I would maybe disagree a little bit about portability. That doesn't necessarily make things more portable, because some of the flags may end up only being specific to a particular operating system for one reason or another. GCC is not necessarily identically built on different operating systems, and depending upon, you may be building your own GCC, right? Like what we do internally. So, but I agree. I think you ought not make any assumptions about the underlying operating system, and make sure that you're explicit about which flags are being set.
Yeah. I meant portability across like the Linux ecosystem.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and of course, cross compilers muddy the waters even further.
Right. Exactly.
If I may, it might also be helpful to add a line in there that if you're doing this from a developer perspective, like on Docker, you should be using GCC container if you're just trying to compile one thing, because GCC does have a separate setup than like the Debian. They use Debian, but they actually compile GCC, and it's like a clean version of GCC without anything, any patch applied to it. So that might also be another way of explaining this, that if you're just trying to compile one thing, then if you use the GCC container and assume nothing is turned on and go from there. And if you're going to use a distro or you're compiling for distros, you should look at this. Now, let me also say this. In all my years of being in Gentoo, what I can say is this, that I think flags are kind of a Goldilocks approach, where if you have too many, it could definitely trip you up. And if you have too few, then you really don't know what's going on. You could have mixed results. So I think that that's also, like, to a certain point needs to be considered, because as I said, most people that I see getting into like compiling entire tool chains and data and AI and stuff like that, most of the time their problem is too many flags, or jumping into O3 like it's nothing, which most of the time is okay, but still.
Yeah, so it sounds like then this like the wording of the text can use a little bit more attention, and maybe like a little bit more clearer messaging about this, that like the recommendation is to always enable at least the hardening flag, since that's what we are focusing on here, explicitly, regardless of the output of GCCV. But at least from my side, I kind of see a value in having this where it is now, like in the main document rather than an appendix, because with even like, especially like if it sort of comes with this sort of like best practice recommendation, I think that would be good to have sort of fairly early in the document.
I agree. It should be in the main document. What whatever's talking about as an appendix is probably an expansion of that, where we talk about what to look for in -v, because when you get GCC, you get the output of GCC -v, there are like 40, 50 different options, and in that you need to look for specific ones to kind of know whether a certain feature is enabled or not. So that bit, I guess, would be useful as an appendix, because without that, the -v kind of note is kind of half-baked, I think.
I do agree with what Sadish is saying, and I think I agree with the appendix. And another thing I was going to say is, I mean, if you wanted to make like a super secure version of GCC and just turn on all the secure flags automatically and use that to compile, because you compile from source, I mean, you could, that is one approach to take, that you could just use all the default flags like default pi and fpi or all that fpic and all that stuff. And you could, just turn everything on that and just build a secure version of GCC. So I think it has value. I just think yeah, I agree with what Sadish said. I think an appendix item would be good.
And it's the appendix item specifically on this, like configuring GCC
by
or
default.
Clang by default, right? But we wouldn't go into like distro specific configuration, so it's more like a general knowledge. Yeah,
correct.
Okay.
Because as I said, like the use case could also be you want to make a GCC that already has it all enabled, so you don't have to keep remembering flags.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a GCC you could compile. So I mean, I think that this fits both use cases better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have any objections to an appendix either. So is this something that you are interested in doing, Randall, since you have been working on?
Yeah, I can do this.
On this. Yeah. But maybe since we are sort of still discussing this PR, so how do you see this, like the Google Doc with the distro specific options? So
the reason that I wasn't able. The reason I wasn't able to get further on that, Thomas, not to cut you off, is because, as I said, there's kind of a confusion of what the default profile is and how that default profile gets generated. Because I talked to my contacts at Debian and no one could actually point me to like a default profile. It was basically like, we enable this by default, so it's this, I guess. So I think that's why I decided to go with this, because I think that this is like more specific, and even as this changes in the future, the document would still be accurate because we're not going to focus on any one specific distro.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration, because I also think that, of course, like for distro specific configurations, the best sort of information is the distro's documentation itself. And I would also not want to get into this situation where we need to sort of continuously update this document to match that.
I would argue that that Debian, that is very true, but some of the other distros have, it gets spicy, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but from the work that you put in already, I think that at least what we can get out of this is that we can sort of look at this delta between the distro options and see if there is any defaults there that we are currently missing and would want to incorporate.
Absolutely.
So I had a brief look at this document, and I think our coverage in terms of hardening options is quite good. I think that there is like this, is it now this V time, which is more like on this reproducible builds
right
area, and I'm a little bit on the fence with that, because I don't think that it's not really about security hardening, but it's more like on this like supply chain side. So so that seems to be sort of part of the delta at least, but I think that maybe the home for that would be in like some other guidance, because I know that there are these efforts for supply chain security guidance.
Yeah, I would also say, and I'm sure Sadish can correct me on this, I would also say that, you know, compiler flag documentation is very light. I would agree with you that maybe keep it off this version, but as we continue to maybe expand, I would say that it's definitely something to look at, because I do know people are into that sort of thing, and it's not necessarily security, but kind of sort of. I mean, reproducible builds is something that is important.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't, all I'm saying is that maybe for our second version, when we look at different things to expand, reproducible builds would definitely not be like a bad thing to, you know, touch on, even if that's just an appendix item, another appendix item saying, you know, reproducible builds are not really considered a security feature, but I mean, it should be happening anyway. And this is our guidance on that.
Yeah, or I'm wondering whether that would be like better as a separate document, but then you can sort of link these together.
That too.
Because I sort of still feel that it's like a little bit of like a different domain with a little bit different considerations, right? Because it's not just about configuring the compiler, but there are other tooling considerations as well that go into it, right? So maybe I'm like a little bit worried about kind of like feature creep in terms of like what we cover, but yeah, I agree that it's sort of also relevant for security, and I think that mentioning it in this guide wouldn't hurt.
Right, and it's also something that Alpha and Omega covers.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, Thomas, you mean something like hardening versus supply chain, like reproducible builds don't do hardening, but they secure the supply chain, as it were.
Yeah, and we also, when we started this initiative, we also had this discussion around like what do we mean by hardening, and like in this context we are specifically focusing on the kind of hardening you do through the compiler options, right? Because we at least based on the initial discussion, we didn't want to get into this whole like software development time hardening, because that's again a much larger area, and there are all sorts of secure coding standards that are already addressing that.
Okay, so basically code bug prevention and bug mitigation. That's basically the limit, right? The scope.
Through mechanisms provided by the compiler or linker. Yeah. But of course, I think that it also sort of doesn't hurt to acknowledge that there are these other ways of doing hardening and providing links to relevant material. At least that's the way I would see it.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I agree.
Agreed.
Okay. But I guess that we'll continue then discussion on this particular PR offline and maybe consider this wording a little bit more. But we still have a couple of other ones open as well. Might be good to look at.
Sure.
So I think the next one is this glib CXX assertions that Dr. Wheeler was working on. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, but I think that you also, Randall, you had reviewed this. There was this you brought up again this question of whether we should provide guidance on like filing bugs against upstream if it doesn't compile with, is it now specifically with this particular option? I remember we started this discussion I think last time, but ran out of time.
Yes, I remember this discussion. Yes, this is because most in the wider Linux community, there are certain flags like the glib cxx flag as the assertions flags. I forget the actual, I'm pretty sure I nailed it, but I could be wrong. But like that flag, for example, if you're trying to compile, I don't know, curl, which should compile with this, and it doesn't compile with this, then you probably have a bug that you should probably report to upstream.
So I do know I do know that at least a few of the distributions, they consider these to be bugs, right, when they package this. But I'm a little bit sort of I'm a little bit sort of like dubious whether it would be sort of wise to make sort of like very general statements about this, because I guess that like different projects can have like different priorities. And I think that we had like this discussion around Vim last time, and like this C language features that Vim decides to use that might not work with this Fortify hardening, right? So I'm a little bit worried whether like this, you know, encouraging people to like file bugs against like these projects which are known and, you know, intentionally like avoid.
I would say that it's a two-sided thing, because it could also be that you go look it up and it is a known issue, and there might be a patch that might be in the works, or there might be work that is, or it's already a known thing, is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, that way you're not telling people to just disable flags. You're disabling flags because you know what you're doing. So I think it's a two-sided. I think I agree with what you're saying 100%. Sadish might be able to give us more insight. I know that from a GCC perspective, I know that there's certain flags that in an ideal world should be safe, like 100%, because these are just like standards we all should comply to. Keyword should, but that's, you know, I'm more of a packager than a participant in the GCC ecosystem. So I said maybe Sadish has better or a better position, but that's what I understand. That I know that like from us in packaging land, if one of these flags doesn't work, then you should ring the alarm.
So for glib cxx assertions, I think it should be so it's a C++ flag, right? So as long as we're filing bugs against C++ projects, it should be fine. But then I do think there are projects that do not enable assertions because they have they could have an overhead, a performance overhead. But yeah, if it fails with glib cxx assertions, then it's likely a bug that triggered it, and it's something that should be looked into.
The other reason
it's a
too,
lot
Thomas,
clearer. It's a lot clearer than Fortify source. Like Fortify source has to deal with a lot of kind of old time warts, as it were, in the C programming language, and like the interplay between like GNU extensions and the C standards and so on. The C++ ecosystem, I think, is a lot clearer in that sense, and because of that, at least in my experience, the glib cxx assertions hasn't had the same kind of problems that Fortify source has had. So you should be able to do that as long as it's limited to the C++ ecosystem, and the project kind of rejects the flag saying that it has a performance overhead, and not because it causes any correctness issues in their code.
I was gonna add also in pros that I think that by adding that, Thomas, my intent or the point of my question is I see a lot of discussions, if you want to call them discussions, that could be avoided if you know that this flag is a bug and just go report it to upstream and don't like cause more issues.
Yeah, this sounds quite quite a sort of like a challenging topic. So I think that I guess that even for like this specific flag, at least like Dr. Wheeler also had like the option that it wouldn't make sense to suggest that, but of course he's not here to provide his view. So I kind of feel that this is not like an entirely not conscious issue.
I think David's point is that how far down this rabbit hole do you really want to go? Because like once you do it for one, like it's going to become an issue on all of, or like, so I think David's point is that like we should stay away from it because of the fact that it would definitely increase maintenance burden. And then you start pushing this line of being opinionated. I think that's his point. And I think that's why he's saying that it would be better right now to keep it as is, which I don't disagree with. But as I said, it depends on kind of what down the line, what we want to like deal with, because it is a bit of a hole to go into, because a lot of these have, and I wouldn't say this type of nuance, but they have different nuances, not to mention some of these flags have history. So if you really want to start getting politically correct, it's again a double-sided sword, because while on one side you're fixing things, you have this other side where it could be more confusing. They don't understand the pretext, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that like I can also see a little bit this sort of issue here with the kind of like the longevity of this guide, right? So let's say that we decide that we should sort of consider each option as its own, whether or not this is sort of whether or not this is something that sort of we could say that it should always be enabled, whether that it has some issues now. But then again, when those features mature and they stop being issues, you would sort of need to continuously like reassess like all these options, right? Like, is it now mature enough, right? So and maybe this kind of like burden is not sort of worth it.
Correct.
Because I think that this guide still has value in terms of like this like informational value, and you can make decisions like you can make these decisions on your own, even if we sort of don't have like a strong stance on this question with regards to like a particular option, with regards to a particular option or in general.
Agreed. Now, Thomas, what would be your vision on making this somewhat more of like a living document? Because I think that keeping this up to date should be a priority, because if it starts getting out of date, then yeah, that's going to be a topic all in of itself.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I would be very happy to see this being a living document, but I could also see sort of, like the risks with sort of like snapshots of this being sort of becoming out of date,
Correct.
right? And I would sort of want to avoid that, like especially when I'm myself maintaining a snapshot of this, which I try not to let become out of date as we do all this valuable work.
Right.
Work like this, and then I would also see that I would maybe see a little bit like if you sort of consider where we spend the effort, I I would maybe see more value in spending the effort in like keeping it up to date with regard to sort of new exciting features, because I feel that this is also an area where there is a lot of development happening continuously. And in a way, I see this as there is like even like accelerating development with all of these hardware assisted approaches, both in like x86 processors as well as like ARM processors. Right. So I saw now that last week that this control flow enforcement for like how this hardware assisted control flow enforcement for user space looks to be merged in Linux for the 6.4 merge window. So I think that this would also be sort of a nice time to look into like adding the relevant options to this guide. And I think that I talked about this a little bit before, that like when I was sort of prioritizing this, I was primarily prioritizing the software-based approaches, because I thought that that's sort of like where you can get the most widespread benefit. But I think it would be really great to sort of try to make this sort of comprehensive, in this sense that we also try to cover like these platform-specific options.
Fair.
Also continuously in the future, right? So that's maybe what I sort of that's sort of like my stance on this, and where sort of where I would want to spend the time, right? But I think that this is also like depending on where there is community interest, right? So if there is community interest in sort of like following these developments on the older options as well, then of course it would be great if we can keep it up to date. But my experience is just that if you're not very centrally involved with working with these options, it can be quite cumbersome to follow these developments continuously.
Well, I'll just say that I think the guide is great either way, you know, and I do think there's a need for it in the community. So I was the basis of my question.
Yeah. But I'm sort of a little bit now. So if I'm trying to sort of like summarize this discussion, like it seems to be like a little bit of a contentious issue, but I think that overall there seems to be like more reasons not to go into like doing like the specific recommendations, either for specific flags or in general. And like especially in general seems to be like more problematic, right? Because of this that they are sort of like real choices involved in enabling or disabling. So
correct.
I would maybe then not pursue, at least at this point in time, adding additional text with regards to that. But overall, I think that the glib cxx assertions text, I mean, I think it's clear we should cover that option in the list of options. And then there was like this question of like in which CLang version this became available, and I tried to dig a little bit into this because it's not really tied to the compiler, right? Because it's a version on the standard library, whether the standard library supports these assertions, and you are just passing through this define. So there is this also for the LLVM project C++ standard library. There's a, as far as I can tell, equivalent option libcpp assert. And I'm like, from my side, I was like mostly wondering whether we should cover that in the same section or whether we should have a separate section for that. So and I think that I'm not like completely decided on that, but I thought that it would be good to bring up here. So if there is sort of features which are more or less equivalent, but the actual option differs between GCC and CLang, should we sort of try to combine them, or should we just treat them as separate options?
At least in this
I would say
context, it
combine.
sounds.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Sanish,
you go first.
No, I was gonna say combine them, but I'll let you go.
No, I was going to say the other way to
Yeah.
actually keep them separate because they're different runtimes, and it might not make sense to mix the two. So
I know that surge flags behave differently in Clang and GCC, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, I would say but I think for the most part they're about the same. So that's all I was gonna say. Combine them, and then we can denote where they differ, just for the sake of brevity.
like you mean in the top table, kind of say glibc XX assertions for GCC,
Yeah.
GCC6 libstd C++, and then /clang 3.3 lib C++. Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that like in the recommended options tables, I think that maybe it would be good to have them as 2 rows, but then when we group them, like for the detail section.
Yes, yeah, that sounds better. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe also point out that they're the libstd C++, lib C++ options and not like GCC Clang.
Yes,
because you can actually mix those two things.
Yeah, that's true. So maybe it would be, I think that I'm already like providing, like sometimes for these versions, I'm referring to the bin utils version. So would it make sense to just directly refer to this, like the C++ standard library by name and the version, which I presume matches the compiler version anyway, but we can sort of specifically name the C++ standard library implementation instead of the compiler.
It probably makes sense, yeah.
Yeah. So
I like that.
Okay, so maybe I can take a stab at this and provide some edits based on this initial PR by Dr. Wheeler. I think we have around 5 minutes left. Did we have another? Oh yeah, I think
I
there
had
is.
a quick question, Thomas.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say that your vision is to release snapshots, are you thinking of releasing like maybe like a yearly snapshot, or is that kind of what you're thinking?
So maybe I was a little maybe I formulated myself a little bit confusingly. I was like more I was like more considering this, that at some point I presume that we would want to publicize this guide when we feel that it's in a shape shape where we feel that it's sort of not maybe like complete, but in a shape where we would actually want to get some attention to it. And what I'm sort of of course the sort of the living document version should be in the GitHub, but I'm also considering the possibility that like this information might be quoted, or there's copies, or there might be like copies of this guide that get sort of like archived somewhere.
Exactly.
And then I would sort of consider that it be becoming like beneficial, that like the text in the guide at least shouldn't like age badly, right? So so that's one consideration I
So are
have.
you thinking about like tagging it, or like making so that there's like, if you quote it at this point, there's like version 2 is kind of like ASVS, for example, where they have 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're at 4. They're going to 5 this year.
I don't know. I mean, we could definitely consider that.
Okay.
But I think that I also we don't really have like a clear sort of roadmap either, right? Or we don't really have like a clear prioritization yet. So
No, but if you want my advice, just
Yeah.
by like some of the other work I've done, I would suggest getting or putting maybe like a due date. 'Cause I think you said you wanted this out to be, or this to be out by a certain date. So
Mhm.
I would say that way we can make a call for, any last suggestions by this date, and whatnot. And that way we
Mhm.
can start moving towards finalizing towards that date. So
Yeah.
just some suggestions.
Yeah, I think that I think that might be a good suggestion. Maybe we are running out of time, so maybe we should leave this to another
Yes.
another meeting. But I think that also we have sort of maybe some things that we sort of should get done before like the version 1.0, right? So we have like this original Google Doc draft, which I think are still working through, right? What like one option at a time. And I think it sort of makes sense to at least make sure that we can incorporate anything of value from there, as well as this the effort you started with the distribution specific options, right? So we have like these sort of clear sources of this material that
Fair.
we can try to work through. But I think that I think that yeah, I think that just process wise, I like this idea to have to like aim for some kind of version 1 and
Date.
version 2. Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah. So
Or
let's,
even we could do point versions too. But yeah.
yeah. Let's I think we are out of time now, but let's keep this in mind and bring it up in like a future meeting and think about this.
Perfect.
Think about this, what to do. Okay, but thanks for a very good discussion. I'll try to summarize also these last parts in the meeting notes, and I wish you all a very good day, and I hope to talk to you all in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.